Ladies and gentlemen, on a cold winter day in 1968, a commercial airliner was hurtling through the sky at 30,000 feet when suddenly every instrument in the cockpit went completely dark. No compass, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, nothing. The pilot couldn't tell which way was up or down. He was flying blind with over 100 souls depending on him to get them home safely. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary feats of aviation in history, a story that aviation experts still study today, a testament to human ingenuity when every system fails and all you have left is your wits and the natural world around you. You know, when we think about modern aviation, we think about all that incredible technology, those sophisticated computers, the GPS systems, the radar, all those instruments that tell pilots exactly where they are at every moment. But what happens when all of that just stops working? What happens when a pilot has to rely on something our ancestors used centuries ago, something so simple yet so powerful that it saved over 100 lives that day? This is the story of Captain Robert Loft, a veteran pilot with Eastern Airlines, and the day he had to navigate using nothing but the reflection of sunlight. And I'm telling you, this story has twists and turns that will make you appreciate just how incredible human problem-solving can be when the chips are down. Now, before we dive into that fateful flight, you need to understand who Captain Loft was. This wasn't some rookie pilot fresh out of training. Robert Loft had been flying for decades. He'd been a military pilot, flown in combat situations, seen things that would make most people never want to set foot in an aircraft again. But he loved flying. It was in his blood. By 1968, he was one of Eastern Airlines' most experienced captains, the kind of pilot other pilots looked up to, the guy who'd seen it all and handled everything with calm professionalism. He was 55 years old, approaching the twilight of his career, with thousands upon thousands of flight hours under his belt. The kind of experience you just can't teach in a classroom. On this particular day, Captain Loft was scheduled to fly a routine route from Newark, New Jersey down to Miami, Florida. Now, this was a route he'd flown hundreds of times before. He could probably have done it with his eyes closed. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, a turboprop airliner that was considered quite reliable for its time. 4 powerful engines, good safety record, comfortable for passengers. Everything about this flight seemed completely ordinary. The weather forecast was decent, passengers were boarding normally, and the pre-flight checks showed everything was functioning perfectly. Just another day at the office for Captain Loft and his crew. The flight took off right on schedule. The climb out from Newark was smooth. Passengers settled in with their magazines and newspapers. Flight attendants began their service. Captain Loft and his first officer were chatting casually in the cockpit, going through the normal routine that pilots do on every flight. Everything was by the book. The sun was shining brightly that day, beautiful clear skies once they got above the cloud layer. You couldn't ask for better flying conditions, or so it seemed. They were cruising along at their assigned altitude when something strange started happening. One of the electrical systems began acting up. Now, in aviation, aircraft have multiple redundant systems specifically so that if one thing fails, you have backups. That's why flying is so incredibly safe. But on this day, something very unusual was occurring. The electrical problem wasn't just affecting one system. It was cascading, spreading through the aircraft's electrical network like dominoes falling one after another. Warning lights started illuminating on the instrument panel. First one, then another, then several at once. Captain Loft's years of experience kicked in immediately. He wasn't panicking. Pilots are trained to handle emergencies with cool heads and methodical thinking. He started running through the troubleshooting procedures, checking circuit breakers, trying to isolate the problem. But the situation was deteriorating faster than he could address it. Within minutes, instruments started going dark. The artificial horizon, which tells pilots their orientation relative to the ground, flickered and died. The directional gyro, which acts like a compass, stopped working. The altimeter, the airspeed indicator, one by one, the instruments that pilots rely on were failing. And then the worst possible thing happened. Total electrical failure. Everything went dark. The cockpit became eerily quiet except for the sound of the engines and the wind rushing past the aircraft. No instrument lights, no navigation aids, no radio communication. Captain Loft found himself in a situation that every pilot dreads but few ever experience. He was flying completely blind with no way to tell which direction he was heading, how high he was, or even if the aircraft was level. When you're inside clouds or can't see the horizon clearly, your inner ear plays tricks on you. You can be in a steep bank and feel like you're flying straight and level. Pilots have crashed because of this sensory illusion. It's called spatial disorientation, and it's deadly. Now here's where Captain Loft's experience became absolutely crucial. He knew that panicking was not an option. He had passengers back there, families, children, people who trusted him to get them safely to their destination. He also had a crew depending on his leadership. So he took a deep breath and started thinking. What resources did he still have? Well, he could look out the window. He could see the sun. He could see the landscape far below when there weren't clouds in the way. And he still had control of the aircraft itself. The engines were running fine. The control surfaces were responding to his inputs. He could still fly the plane physically. He just couldn't navigate using instruments. That's when Captain Loft remembered something from his early training, something that went back to the very basics of aviation, back to the pioneers who flew with nothing but their eyes and their instincts. The sun moves across the sky in a predictable path. It rises in the east and sets in the west. Now, this isn't perfect navigation, especially because the sun's exact position varies by season and latitude, but it was something. It was a reference point. And more importantly, Captain Loft realized he could use the sun's reflection on the wing to maintain orientation. You see, when you're flying an aircraft, keeping it level is absolutely critical. If you enter a bank without realizing it, that bank can increase, you can enter a spiral, and before you know it, you're in an uncontrolled descent. But Captain Loft noticed that when the sun hit the aircraft's polished aluminum wing at certain angles, it created reflections and shadows that changed depending on the aircraft's attitude. If the wing was level relative to the horizon, the reflection pattern looked one way. If the aircraft was banking, the pattern changed. It was crude, incredibly crude compared to the sophisticated instruments he was used to, but it was information. And information was exactly what he needed. So Captain Loft began flying using the sun's reflection as his primary attitude reference. He kept his eyes moving between the wing, the sun's position in the sky, and the ground far below whenever he could see it through breaks in the clouds. He was essentially doing what sailors had done for centuries, navigating by celestial references, but he was doing it at 200 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. And he had to do it continuously because, unlike a ship, an aircraft that isn't being actively controlled will quickly depart from controlled flight. But navigation was only part of the problem. Captain Loft still needed to figure out where he was and how to get to an airport. Remember, he had no radio, no way to communicate with air traffic control, no way to get help or guidance. He was completely on his own. He started looking for landmarks on the ground, trying to orient himself based on geography. He knew the general route they'd been following before the electrical failure. They'd been heading south along the eastern seaboard. So he looked for the coastline, for major cities, for anything distinctive that could tell him where he was. Time was also becoming a factor. The aircraft was burning fuel constantly. Captain Loft had no fuel gauges working, so he couldn't tell exactly how much fuel remained, but he knew roughly how much they'd started with and approximately how long they'd been flying. He did some quick mental calculations. They had enough fuel to reach Miami, but if he got lost or had to divert significantly off course, they could run out of fuel before finding a suitable airport. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Then he spotted it. Through a break in the clouds, he saw what looked like a major highway and a distinctive river pattern. Years of flying, this route paid off because he recognized the geography. He wasn't as far off course as he'd feared. He could still make it to Miami if he could just maintain the right heading. Using the sun's position and his knowledge of the time of day, he adjusted his course, making small corrections, constantly monitoring that reflection on the wing to keep the aircraft steady. The first officer beside him was calling out what few instruments were still working mechanically, things that didn't depend on electrical power. They had an old-fashioned magnetic compass that was still functioning, though it was slow to respond and could be unreliable during turns. They also had a standby altimeter that operated on air pressure alone. These basic instruments, combined with Captain Loft's sun navigation technique, gave them just enough information to continue flying safely. As they got closer to the Miami area, Captain Loft faced another critical challenge. He needed to descend and find the airport, but he couldn't just drop altitude randomly. He had to know where other aircraft were, and he had to let the airport know he was coming. Without radio communication, this was extremely dangerous. Other aircraft wouldn't know he was there. Air traffic control wouldn't be able to clear a path for him. He was essentially an invisible aircraft, about to enter one of the busiest airspaces on the East Coast. Captain Loft decided on a bold strategy. He would descend slowly toward where he knew Miami International Airport was located, and he would rock his wings as he approached, a universal aviation signal that means an aircraft is in distress or has communication failure. He hoped that other pilots would see him and that someone on the ground would notice. It was risky, but he was running out of options. The fuel situation was becoming critical. As they descended, passing through layers of clouds, Captain Loft never stopped using the sun's reflection to maintain control. It had become second nature now, this constant monitoring of how the light played across the wing surface. He was literally reading the sunlight like an instrument, interpreting every shift in shadow and brightness as information about the aircraft's attitude. It was exhausting, requiring total concentration, but it was working. Then, breaking through the final cloud layer, Captain Loft saw the beautiful sight of the Miami coastline. And there, exactly where he knew it should be, was Miami International Airport. But his problems weren't over. He still had to land this aircraft without being able to communicate with the tower, without functioning landing gear indicators to tell him if the gear was down and locked, and without many of the instruments that pilots normally use during approach and landing. Captain Loft circled the airport, rocking his wings. On the ground, air traffic controllers spotted the unusual behavior and quickly understood something was wrong. They could see the aircraft but couldn't communicate with it. They immediately stopped all other traffic, clearing the airspace and the runway. They rolled out emergency equipment, fire trucks and ambulances, preparing for the worst. Nobody on the ground knew exactly what was happening up there, but they knew it wasn't good. Captain Loft lined up for his approach, using visual references and that sun reflection technique he'd been using for the past hour. He lowered the landing gear manually, feeling the thunk as it extended, but he had no green lights to confirm it was locked in place. He'd have to trust it. As he descended toward the runway, he kept his eyes moving constantly. Airspeed by the sound of the wind and the feel of the controls, altitude by visual reference to the ground, alignment with the runway by sight. It was like flying had been in the early days of aviation, pure stick and rudder flying, pilot skill against the forces of nature. The runway rose up to meet them. Captain Loft adjusted his approach, compensating for wind, managing his descent rate by feel and experience. The passengers in back had no idea just how dire their situation had been. They knew something was wrong because the flight attendants had prepared them for an emergency landing, but they couldn't see what was happening in the cockpit, couldn't know that their pilot had been navigating by sunlight for the past hour. The wheels touched down, not a perfect landing, a bit firm, but they were down. The landing gear held. Captain Loft applied the brakes, also operating manually without his normal instruments. The aircraft rolled down the runway and gradually slowed. As it finally came to a stop, there was a moment of absolute silence in the cockpit. Then Captain Loft let out a long breath. They'd made it. Every single person on board was safe. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately. When Captain Loft finally shut down the engines and opened the cockpit door, he was greeted by amazed ground crew and investigators who couldn't believe what they were hearing. He'd flown for over an hour with no instruments, navigating by the sun and his own skill, and successfully landed at his destination with everyone unharmed. It was extraordinary. The investigation into the electrical failure revealed a rare combination of circumstances that led to the cascading system failures. It was the kind of one-in-a-million event that nobody had really anticipated. But what really captured everyone's attention was how Captain Loft had handled it. Aviation experts studied his technique of using the sun's reflection as an attitude indicator. It became a teaching case, an example of how fundamental piloting skills and creative thinking can overcome even catastrophic system failures. Now, what makes this story so powerful isn't just the technical achievement, although that's certainly impressive. It's what it tells us about human capability. Here was a man in his 50s who could have frozen up, who could have panicked when everything went wrong. Instead, he drew on decades of experience, remembered basic principles from the earliest days of aviation, and adapted them to save lives. He didn't have fancy technology to rely on. He had the sun, the same sun that has guided travelers for thousands of years, and he had his own skill and determination. Think about what was going through his mind during that flight. The weight of responsibility for all those lives, the uncertainty of whether his improvised navigation would work, the physical and mental exhaustion of maintaining total concentration for over an hour, never able to relax for even a moment. And yet he kept going, kept problem-solving, kept flying that aircraft with steady hands and a calm mind. You know, we live in an age where we've become so dependent on technology that we sometimes forget the fundamental skills underneath. We trust GPS to navigate for us, computers to fly our planes, sophisticated systems to handle things automatically. And most of the time, that works wonderfully. But Captain Loft's story reminds us that technology is just a tool. When it fails, when the systems go dark and the computers stop working, it's human knowledge, human skill, human determination that makes the difference between tragedy and triumph. There's something deeply moving about the simplicity of his solution, too. He didn't need a complicated backup system or an expensive piece of equipment. He needed the sun, something that's been there since the beginning of time, something that will be there long after all our computers and instruments have turned to dust. There's a poetry in that, don't you think? This ancient, reliable source of light and warmth became his guide through a modern crisis. After this incident, Captain Loft became something of a legend in aviation circles. Other pilots would ask him about that flight, wanting to understand exactly how he did it, wanting to learn from his experience. And true to his modest nature, he would explain it simply. He'd say that he just used what was available, that any experienced pilot would have done the same. But those who knew aviation understood that what he'd accomplished required not just experience, but also creativity, courage, and exceptional flying skill. The passengers on that flight, once they learned the full story of what had happened, were amazed. Many of them wrote letters to Captain Loft, thanking him for getting them home safely. Some of them had been on their way to vacations, others to visit family, all of them with plans and dreams and people waiting for them. Because of Captain Loft's skill and ingenuity, they got to continue their lives, got to see their loved ones again, got to experience all the moments big and small that make up a human life. Eastern Air Lines recognized Captain Loft's achievement, and the aviation community honored him for his exceptional airmanship. But for Captain Loft himself, he viewed it simply as doing his job. That's the mark of true professionalism, isn't it? When someone does something extraordinary and then treats it as if it was just another day at work. But it wasn't just another day, and it wasn't ordinary. It was one of those rare moments when everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and a person rises to meet that challenge with every ounce of skill, and courage they possess. This story also changed how airlines and aviation authorities thought about redundancy and backup systems. The particular combination of failures that affected Captain Loft's aircraft led to improvements in electrical system design. Engineers worked to ensure that future aircraft would have better separation of critical systems, so a single failure couldn't cascade and take out everything at once. In that way, Captain Loft's experience not only saved the lives of his passengers that day, but also contributed to making aviation safer for everyone who would fly in the years to come. But beyond the technical lessons, there's a human lesson here that resonates far beyond aviation. Life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at us. Things we never planned for, situations we never imagined we'd have to face. And in those moments, we discover what we're really made of. We find out whether we'll panic or stay calm, whether we'll give up or keep fighting, whether we'll find creative solutions or be paralyzed by fear. Captain Loft showed us that with experience, skill, and determination, we can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. It's also a reminder to respect the wisdom and capability of experienced professionals. Captain Loft was 55 years old when this happened, at a time when some people might have considered him past his prime. But it was precisely his decades of experience, all those thousands of hours of flying in all kinds of conditions, that gave him the knowledge and confidence to handle this crisis. He'd built up a mental library of techniques and solutions over his long career, and when he needed it, that knowledge was there. There's something inspiring about knowing that such stories exist, that there are moments when individual human beings accomplish seemingly impossible things. In our daily lives, most of us will never face a crisis quite like Captain Loft's, but we all face our own challenges, our own moments when things go wrong and we have to figure out how to make them right. And when we face those moments, we can remember this story and take courage from it. If a pilot can navigate by sunlight and land a plane full of people safely after losing all his instruments, then we can handle the challenges that come our way. The sun reflection technique that Captain Loft used wasn't something he invented on the spot, by the way. It was based on principles that go back to the very early days of aviation, when pilots had minimal instruments and had to rely heavily on visual cues and natural references. The pioneers of flight used the sun, the stars, landmarks, rivers, railroads, anything they could see to find their way. As aviation became more sophisticated, these primitive navigation methods were gradually replaced by instruments and electronics. But the fundamental principles never went away, and when Captain Loft needed them, they were still valid, still effective. In fact, even today, pilots are taught basic visual navigation skills as part of their training, even though they'll spend most of their careers relying on sophisticated electronic systems. The reason is simple. You need to understand the fundamentals, need to know how to fly the aircraft using just your eyes and your skills, because you never know when you might need those basic abilities. Captain Loft's flight proved the wisdom of maintaining those fundamental skills even in an age of advanced technology. After this incident, Captain Loft continued flying for a few more years before retiring. He lived a long life, passing away eventually as an old man, but he was always remembered in aviation circles for that remarkable flight. When pilots gather and tell stories, when instructors teach lessons about airmanship and problem-solving, Captain Loft's name comes up. His flight has become one of those legendary moments that defines what it means to be not just a pilot, but a true aviator, someone who understands their craft at the deepest level. And you know what's really beautiful about this story? The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Captain Loft didn't need some dramatic, complicated rescue. He didn't need someone to save him. He saved himself and his passengers by going back to basics, by using simple observation and fundamental flying skills. Sometimes the best solutions aren't the most complex ones. Sometimes the answer is right there in front of you, as obvious and constant as the sun in the sky. if you just have the wisdom to see it and the skill to use it. So the next time you're on an airplane, cruising along at altitude with the sun shining through the windows, take a moment to think about Captain Robert Loft and his remarkable flight. Think about how that same sun you're seeing, that same ancient star that has guided travelers since humans first began to journey, became the instrument that brought a plane load of people home safely. It's a story that connects the very old and the very new, that shows us how human ingenuity bridges the gap between primitive and modern, between simple and sophisticated. Captain Loft's story reminds us that knowledge, experience, and clear thinking under pressure are worth more than any technology. It reminds us that when we face seemingly impossible situations, creativity and determination can find a way through. And it reminds us that sometimes the most important tools we have aren't the ones we can buy or build, but the ones that nature provides freely to everyone: the sun, the stars, the world around us, if we just remember how to read them. That's the story of the American pilot who landed his plane using only the sun's reflection. A story of one man's extraordinary skill and courage, a testament to the power of experience and fundamental knowledge, and a reminder that even in our high-tech modern world, the simplest natural phenomena can become the tools of survival when we know how to use them.